Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. It's great to have you with us. My name is Sarah, also known as Meg Davis at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. And very happy to be here with Mandy Govender, who's going to be my co-moderator today. So over to you, Mandy.
Welcome everybody to the session on digital colonialism. I'm not a digital expert, neither am I a colonial expert, except my people have been colonized twice, once when my people were in India and again in South Africa. So from that perspective, and also, just talking about digital colonialism, I can share my perspective from somebody who's worked in the digital space and the public health space in a developing world situation where I've seen data being harvested and then taken out of the country, analyzed, and then parachuted back in the country with no context. So this session for me is something that's been long due in coming. And I'm really excited for the speakers today and the session today, because I'm quite keen to, from my perspective as somebody who's new to the space, understand a bit more about what drives this and how we can actually turn this tide around. So on that note, I'll stop talking and hand over back to Meg so she can introduce you to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mandy. This panel really grew out of conversations that Mandy and I were having, I guess it's almost a year ago now, but really excited to have all these diverse panelists with us today with very different areas of expertise and experience. Want to encourage you to please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. Since we can't offer you a glass of wine or a piece of cheese, we can at least offer you the chance to network in the chat box. So please do that and feel free to share resources and links. And use the Q&A function for any questions you have to those of us in the roundtable. So our starting point for this discussion begins in 2019 when researchers Nick Coldry and Ulysses A. Mejias published The Cost of Connection, How Data is Colonizing Human Life and Appropriating it for Capitalism. And this book argued that new technologies and our increasing shift towards online life are not actually that new, but rather are an expansion of existing historical inequalities formed under colonialism. So as we're in Digital Health Week, this seems like a good moment to do a little bit of analysis of whether this is a fair description of digital health, and if so, what we need to change. We have the perfect panel of experts for this. So Ulysses Mejias is professor and director of the Institute for Global Engagement at State University of New York. Nomtika Mjwana is project manager, Digital Health and Rights at the Global Network of People Living with HIV, also known as GNP+. And she's also a colleague with me on the Digital Health and Rights Project at the Graduate Institute. Daniel Otsoy is co-founder and executive director of the Central American Health Informatics Network, RCANSA. And Sharifa Sekalala is a reader, School of Law at the University of Warwick. So to kick us off, Ulysses, can you help us to understand what is data colonialism? Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's joining us. So I will try to give you sort of like the short introduction of what data colonialism is. And I think also it might help to compare it to other concepts, especially surveillance capitalism, because I know that's a term that some people are more familiar with. So basically, in our book, The Cost of Connection, my co-author, Nick Coldry, and I argue that there is basically a new land grab going on. And this time, the race to grab resources is not for land, is not for human labor or oil or minerals. It is for data. And that is why we call this phenomenon data colonialism. So let me give you sort of like the official definition of data colonialism. We say that it is an emerging social and economic order for the continuous appropriation of human life through data for the explicit purpose of generating profit. So we're not against data. We're not against data collection. Obviously, especially in the health field, data can be very powerful and useful. But we are specifically concerned about this extraction of data from our lives for the explicit purpose of generating profit. Now, let's think about it in terms of this progression of 500 years of colonialism, which basically started with this concept of cheap nature. Yeah, in order to colonize the world, nature had to be defined or rendered as cheap. It was just there. It was abundant. It was free, just there for the taking. More importantly, it didn't have an owner, or at least a civilized owner. From there, we moved to cheap labor, because in colonialism, certain humans, and this was mostly determined by race, as you know, they were meant to provide the labor required to transform nature into wealth. So we started with cheap nature, then we had cheap labor, now we have cheap data. And if you think about it, it shares many of the same characteristics of nature and labor. Again, it's supposed to be abundant. It's supposed to be free, just there for the taking, without an owner, right? I mean, we might own it individually, but when it is collected, gathered, it can only be processed by big corporations with advanced technology. So they are the ones who can actually refine it and do something useful with it. So, and I said I wanted to talk a little bit about surveillance capitalism and the work of Shoshana Zuboff. And of course, her work has been very influential to our own as well. But I think there are 4 important advantages to the data colonialism thesis. So just to wrap my introductory comments, I would like to review those 4 things briefly. So first of all, I think data colonialism can be more useful than surveillance capitalism because it extends the scale. We are no longer talking about 40 years of the development of the internet. We are talking about a 500-year history of extractivism. Now, of course, we're not making a one-to-one comparison. The initial forms of colonialism were very different than the ones we have today in terms of form and content. But we're saying that there's one very important similarity, that is the function. The function of the old colonialism and the new colonialism is the same, and that function is to dispossess, to extract. So to look at it in a history of 500 years, I think it allows us to start to see some continuities. The second point is in terms of scope. Surveillance capitalism, as the name suggests, focuses on surveillance. And data colonialism, we sort of try to broaden the view because it's not just about the extractivism that happens through social media, through targeted advertising, through digital devices. Now we're looking at a whole social quantification sector. We're looking at data analysis, data brokerage, AI data, logistics, all of those things. We can sort of start to look at them under this umbrella. Number 3, and I think this one is important, we're no longer just talking about a few bad apples. I think in surveillance capitalism, the thesis is that a couple of these big tech corporations are doing things that are not right. If we can fix them, we can fix capitalism and we can move on. And so what we're trying to do with the data colonialism thesis is to define a new way of thinking about the relationship between capitalism and colonialism by arguing that there is something extractive that we need to look at. And lastly, I think there is a geopolitical dimension to data colonialism. So it's not just about the West, it's not just about Silicon Valley, it's also about what's happening in China and how this race to grab resources between these 2 poles of power, the West and China, is basically shaping the world. So that's kind of like a short summary of the thesis.
Thank you, Ulysses. That was short, sweet, and gave me some new insights as well. I think I want to move on to, from what you've just shared, to the rest of the panelists to ask how do they see these trends around particularly data colonialism playing out in their different fields and in their different areas of work. So I open up to the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Can I go?
Sure.
Sorry. So in my work, so I'm a global health lawyer, and one of the things that really struck me was the way in which regulation was organized in comparison to what the phenomena that Ulysses describes. And so it really struck me that on the one hand, you had this huge extractive process, but regulation was being defined very individually. So individuals had to do things in order to ensure that their data was not moved. And so it felt to me like you had a really strange disconnect between the ways in which most African countries were really thinking about the regulatory process of what was a huge extractive process that went massively beyond the individual in terms of how they could consent, how they understood what was happening, whether they understood that this was an extractive process, but also ideas around temporality were really super important. So people were being asked for their data at points where they were super desperate and saying, well, you need to give away your data in order to access this health service. And it felt to me that it was really important to kind of unpick that process within this colonial lens, as opposed to really thinking about these individual transactions within a regulatory lens, as was being described in this context, where it was merely people saying you have a right to privacy and people need to opt out, and really not thinking about the wider infrastructure, I think was one of the things that was important. The second thing is our study took place in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. And what really struck us was, in some ways, the ways in which these countries were they themselves powerless against this wider phenomena. So there was a lot of talk from people who worked in international institutions around this huge fourth industrial revolution and how these countries should not be left behind. And so countries were really quite desperate to get involved in this process. And healthcare is still by large really governed by the state in these countries. And so this is not kind of an individual thing where individuals are getting involved. It's the state that is organizing this state of affairs. And that for me was really important. But I think that what also, that powerlessness was also expressed in different ways. So we had one instance that we looked at, which wasn't health, but was really telling about the powerlessness of the state. So after the Kenyan election, when the case went to the Supreme Court, you had the judges try to look at the data because it had been the first kind of digitized election. And they were just unable to because the servers were in France. And that made lots of people really worried about these relationships, but in a set of quite powerlessness because of the way in which regulation, again, just as Ulysses was talking about, data is, on the one hand, it's borderless. So this data can easily move from place to place, but regulation organizes itself within borders. And so you have these two processes that are side by side, but that are really kind of not in sync with each other. And I think that that was, for us, really fascinating in this project. So I will stop there.
I'll ask Daniel if he has anything to add to this with his experience in the region that he's working in as well.
Yeah, thank you first. Thanks for the invitation. I think that this is a really interesting topic of discuss, especially in the case where you live in a third world country like me, because, well, if you know the history of Latin America, and especially the Central American history is about colonialism. It's about to be all the time depending of a third party, right? So yeah, I think that is complex because I think that maybe in these kind of discussions are more often in for example in Europe or the United States, Canada, but it's complex to have this discussion in Latin America and the third world countries, because you have a strong presence and a strong dependence, economic dependences from other countries. So you can say, I don't know, it's my opinion, but you can have serious problems to talk about, for example, against the United States government, for example, because we have a strong presence of USAID in our countries. So this is a very, I don't know, it's a complex situation. We have this barrier to express ourselves freely. And I think, well, I am sometimes paranoid about how the relationships between the countries through the economic war mechanisms are so perverse, right? And I was thinking, hearing Ulysses, that colonialism is a strong word, but maybe esclavism is an actual word in many countries, because you totally depend economically in the health, commercial, education, all is related with external cooperation. We have in Central America, especially, high quotes of corruption in the governments. So this is another key element, because you cannot have a strong legislation about that, because there are many interests. The politician not necessarily responds to the needs of the people. They respond on strong interests. For example, we have the situation of drug traffic, human traffic here, and the government many times is some members of the governments are part of that networks of corruption and crime. So, well, it's interesting, as I mentioned at the first moment, because in my case, of course, I work in the health sector with the digital health, but when you see in the digital world, especially, all is connected. Is related with the economy, is related with the education, is related with the social determinants. Actually, we can talk about the digital determinants now, and I think that this is a very good point to understand, because there are many views about it. It's like a cube, right? You can have different approaches from the different sectors. So, well, I think that this is a very good starting point. So back to you, Mandy and Meg.
Thanks, Daniel. I think I'm just going to finish off my little section now to ask Nomtika to speak towards some of these inequalities that Sharifa, Ulysses, and Daniel mentioned. How do you see it reflected, particularly with young people and other marginalized groups as well?
Yeah, I just, whenever, when Ulysses was speaking about how just the extraction of data has shifted over time, and now we are looking at how it's happening digitally, I had a bit of a ding moment there, because one of the ways in which we've really observed the uptake of digital health is the way in which that also continues to exacerbate some of the stratifications that already exist in the health system outside of the digital space. And really that includes the extraction of people's information and data, and the lack of knowledge from those people around what happens to that kind of information that they are giving away. And that leads me to this I had a really ding moment when Sharifa, you mentioned individuals having to do things in order to ensure that their data is not being extracted. I thought this is what with all the work that we've been doing, even with Meg at GNP, what we've been referring to, I guess I would say loosely as digital literacy, digital empowerment, not really knowing how to frame this, because really from a community perspective, it starts there. One of the exercises that we recently started doing as part of our empowerment and research project was asking people around privacy policies, the level of understanding, what options they choose, if they have to accept cookies or not, and whether or not they know the reasons they have those options, and what happens when they actually make those selections. So I think what Daniel was reflecting on digital determinants has been something that we've really looked quite closely into. And some of these factors, such as, for example, risk, which we speak about a lot, right? Risks to privacy and confidentiality being compromised, how that plays out with how it impacts young people, especially in these countries that we've been looking at, such as Ghana, within the global, what we often refer to as the global South, is that when we talk about access and geographical divide and the digital divide, sometimes it isn't even just about or solely just geographical, or looking at it within the context of households, being often headed by men, and those people are responsible for the only device that's in the house. But sometimes with young people who are able to be online and access health services, what would usually happen, is that they would probably have their parents looking at their phones. So I don't actually have that privacy, even outside of me not knowing what happens to my data as I upload it on an app online. I also don't really fully have access to that kind of privacy and confidentiality because I'm not in control of my own device. And so the same challenges that they would face if they go to a health facility in their school uniform and they get chased away because they want to access sexuality education plays out differently in how they access digital information. Yet the data that they put in is still being collected and used. And as Daniel said, it can be good within the health context. But I think there's so much gaps around the level of understanding from young people, marginalized communities. What happens when I put in information around me being a queer person, me being a sex worker in context where our rights are either we're marginalized or we're criminalized. So there really has been many ways in which we've seen how it's easy to kind of expect people that we consider to be service users to give off their information and data in the name of, because it's good for you, it's for your development. But there also hasn't been, a lot of inclusive processes around how those programs are shaped and how these actually become beneficial to these people that we consider the service users. So again, just to close, what Daniel was also reflecting on around being in developing countries that depend quite heavily economically on either other states or funders, there's a lot of definition on what health programming looks like. And in the same way that we always say, do not leave communities behind, in those instances, the same happen within the digital context as well. So just inclusivity in these design processes. And again, because we work with different kinds of communities, those things could also mean being mindful about defining what confidentiality and privacy is, even in the kind of content that we design and we develop in these platforms. So it's really a web of a lot of intersecting issues, Mandy, and I hope my rambling has covered some of them.
It's fantastic stuff, Namtika, and I think we're really kind of getting to the heart of the issues because we have to have this very intersectional lens, I think, when we think about power in the digital transformation, but also, this recognition, this is a hugely dynamic and rapidly changing scene that we're looking at. And so I want to kind of come to the question of the roles of the different actors and thinking about, for starters, governments, because for instance, I was on a chat on Clubhouse a couple months ago with, it turned out to be all these African officials who were talking about we see data being extracted around us all the time and we don't understand what we should be doing. Let's start with the state. What is the role of the state right now to try to rein in this process and rein in this Wild West that we seem to have? And this is really for anyone, I think, but I don't know if Daniel or Ulysses, if you have to start with thoughts about this.
Sure, I guess I'll say quickly, of course, the role of the state and the role of NGOs is crucial. Unfortunately, when we look at the role of the state, we also have lots of centuries of history of the state not providing the role that a supportive role. And we have to understand that colonialism was always a partnership between the state and the corporations. And the state provided the moral framework, if you will, for corporations to do all of the pillaging. And I would say, unfortunately, that continues to happen even up to today. But I did want to go back to some of the comments that were also made about just whether this word colonialism fits, whether it can help us. And I think it can. And I think the reason is also maybe we can use the word coloniality, which I don't know if some of you are aware of. It's a term developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. And his point was basically that, okay, let's assume colonialism is over. There are no more colonies. Of course, if we ask our friends in Puerto Rico or Palestine, they might disagree with even that concept, but let's assume there are no more colonies. But the legacy of colonialism continues. So as Namtika was saying, colonialism, data colonialism is not unfolding in a vacuum. It's affecting all of us, but it's affecting different communities differently. So the violence that is perpetrated continues to focus mostly on minorities, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, women, the poor, and of course, then there's all of the violence, unleashed on the environment. So those legacies of colonialism continue. And so the government plays a key role in either trying to control that or giving free rein to the corporations that are doing all of that destruction as well.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that the role of the state is very important, but the problem, as I mentioned, is when you have weak institutionalism, you have a lot of corruption because you don't trust in the state, and the intervention of the state as a regulatory mechanism between all the stakeholders. This is a myth. It's not the reality. So I think that this is the most important challenge, how we build the governance necessary, including the legally, the regulation, the strategic frameworks, to have stronger institutions, to have this role of regulation. But also I think that there are other important stakeholders like the civil society. And I think that this is the challenge, because when people is engaged with some specific topic, you have the pressure of the population. But when the population is not necessarily well educated about the topics, about, for example, privacy, the reality is in our countries that the privacy doesn't exist. You, for example, in the health sector, you need healthcare attention. And if the other side asks you for a lot of data, you are not thinking about privacy. You are thinking that you need healthcare attention. And this is a huge problem, because we don't have this mechanism to secure or ensure that the people is well attended in the healthcare sector, for example, as I said. But there are other mechanisms protecting you, protecting your data, regulating the other side who is asking for your data. So I think that the role of the state is very important. But as I mentioned, I think that the challenge is in those scenarios when you have a weak state, a weak regulation, a lot of corruption, and other most important or high interest on that.
Could I add something to
that? Yeah, please.
I think that when we think about regulation, I think we've also thought about it too narrowly. And so, for instance, when in our project, we had quite a lot of uptake from like medical regulators who are in that really strange space. So they're regulators, they serve an important regulatory function, but they're not the states. In some ways, they want to be very independent from the state, or pharmaceutical regulators, because one of the things that we found was many things that delivered health services did not even call themselves health apps. So they were transport apps that just then delivered you medicines. And so these fell in that gray area that were not under any traditional regulation, but it was really important to engage with those other stakeholders in order to think about what was your regulatory function and what do you think of this new phenomena? What do you think the risks of this new phenomenon are? And so you then have, I guess, pressure points at different points in terms of what the regulation looks like, because I think that that's important to engage with those other stakeholders who've been regulating in those spaces as well.
Yeah,
I agree.
Great point, Sharifa. Oh, no, go ahead, Namtika. I was just going to point out that we've been talking to all these young people who are using social media to get health information.
Exactly.
You're going to talk to them. Go ahead, please.
I was going to mention that as well, especially with what Sharifa just reflected on now around how some of the apps are not necessarily even health apps. And that's one of the things that we've been seeing come out as well, which is people will be using Facebook, Twitter, even commenting on YouTube or inboxing influencers who do health or, you know, any kind of information on YouTube around very serious health issues, people taking pictures. So it's really thinking about, firstly, I would say the role of the state is recognizing that it's not just their role. and just removing the state. I don't know if I should say them or, but removing the state from that sort of singular, you are supposed to figure out what this is, and really coming in from that point of recognizing that there's a certain level of accountability from the private sector and most individuals and people that invest in these types of digital technologies that needs to really be exercised. But then also there's a really, I think, supposed to be a differentiated co-creative model in the various ways in which we engage with communities and with people around data. But that co-creative model really should be emphasizing again, the empowerment and a level of transparency, because really the question sometimes can be confused with, is tech good or bad, or do we actually see the potential and opportunities of what these developments and innovations can do? And we do, but there's also that gap in autonomy and transparency, and people actually understanding the rights that they have as communities, particularly because those are people that are usually affected by having their data extracted. And we've always said this again over the years, without knowing what happens to their information and them not necessarily benefiting from all of this. So it's really just having these really strong differentiated co-creative models that recognize and put communities at the center. And I think that's defined by where we are and what we need to engage in. So the state really needs to recognize the fact that it's not just something that they need to do, and how we involve the different stakeholders can be from a point of transparency and accountability, especially if we're talking about the private sector as investors or people that are working in these spaces and innovations.
Thanks, Nomtika. I think that this leads us quite nicely into the next area that we wanted to talk about, and this is also a hotspot, and this was mentioned briefly by Daniel. And Keen Essom actually mentioned it on the chat as well. I think that it is important for these intergovernment bilateral organizations to be involved in this conversation, because some of the investments are driving this behavior. And I understand from their perspective in the sense that a lot of the investments are driven by data. And in order to continue their investments, they need that data. But there's a whole another kettle of fish. I mean, it's a rabbit hole when you go down that space. So I'm keen to hear from the participants, looking at their current role, which I think is, and I'm just speaking as myself now, is very minimal. What do you think it could be and what it should be? And as part of what Nomtika was saying, it's not just one role. There's a lot of parties that need to come together. What do they play? What role do they play in this space? So maybe I hand over to Ulysses.
Well, I think this is an area where my co-panelists probably have a lot more concrete experience. I think, similarly to what I said about the government, I think NGOs and international organizations can definitely play a role, but we should remember that historically these bodies have more often than not aligned themselves with certain interests, and the interest of the powerful. So, but I do think they can put more pressure. And to go back to what Daniel was saying, I think civil society can play a key role here, because I know it's perhaps sounding too idealized, but civil society should sort of set the agenda or the direction for government, for NGOs to move in certain directions. But I definitely think they can play a role if it's done correctly. I think, unfortunately, what happens many times these days is that everyone assumes these problems are too complex and we should let the market sort of work it out. So I think that's kind of like the default reaction that, okay, if we just let the market sort of develop its own mechanisms to deal with these problems, it will be okay. And as we're hearing many times, it's not.
I'm keen to understand from Sharifa, Nomtika, and Daniel, if you have experience of, where one of these bilaterals have tried to tackle this issue and successfully, or maybe not so successfully. You don't have to mention the bilateral, but you can mention the experience.
Yeah, so I think in our experience, they were a huge part of the problem. And so, if you look at Meg's work on kind of datification and what that does, that they were a huge part of the problem in terms of pressing for more data, better data. And I think there is now, I think, an interesting counterbalance in terms of people asking questions about whether more data itself gives us the information that we need for health systems, about the things that we miss, which I think is really interesting. But I think going back to Ulysses' point is one of the things that I think we found when we spoke to people was a sense that there were many young people who were heavily into technology, but who we haven't really engaged with in sufficient depth. So there seems to be a kind of an idea that if you're good at technology, you have to end up working for big technological companies. And so I think there is something in there about what the resistance looks like and how we can organize it, because there are many young people who have these concerns. There are many young people who would like to work for corporations or organizations that try to do some resistance. But I think that we're not serving them by almost saying it's too big, it's too, in some ways, impossible. And for me, I guess that's, so somebody asked me, why do you use colonialism and not capitalism or surveillance? And for me, there was something about the language of coloniality here, digital coloniality, that seemed to give me some language about resistance and what that resistance looks like, in a way in which I think capitalism seems like a self-perpetuating and self-fulfilling prophecy of it's happened already, we're never going to have a system, there are no alternatives. And I think that there is already some idea about what resistance could look like. So some ideas around people thinking about property in different ways. We're already having these discussions around intellectual property and alternatives. And so people are really starting to think about what health data should look like. So there's been lots of work on ethics in terms of biospecimens and how those should be communally owned, that I think we can then start to reimagine how communal health data should look like. And so I think that that's these are really kind of important small trends that are happening in other areas that I think that we can start to really think about, but also to work with people who are thinking about resistance in these areas in order to try and find different solutions.
That was beautifully said, Sharifa, and not just because of the shout out to my book, but thank you for that too. But I think that is really reflecting, you know, the conversations that Nomtika and the group of researchers we're working with, that we've had with young people starting in Kenya, was that they were so excited to know about the fact that they had rights in this space and that they were not just individual consumers, and to start to think critically about how they could mobilize and advocate for more. And they were just eating up anything we could share with them about that. And earlier today, I was on one of the Digital Health Week panels on Kenya, where there was this huge participation and a lot of energy to talk about data extractivism, corruption, regulation. So I think we're at the cusp of a moment where people are really going to mobilize. And I think that makes it quite exciting. But with that, let's turn towards thinking about the future. And I want to encourage people to keep posting questions in the Q&A, please, and we'll come to those next. But how do we envision a different future, a decolonized digital health? And I'm looking at Tika, but really this is for anyone, Daniel, Ulysses.
Yeah. Yes, so I'm reflecting on just the emphasis on the important role of civil society really in addressing digital colonialism around digital rights and so on. And just sitting here from a health perspective, from really working with communities, in communities, and just having been in the CSO space for a while, there's so much work, there's so much activism that and human rights work that unfolds in this space, and the digital, shifting to the digital, especially within the health context, has been, it's something that's been coming up, obviously, but obviously due to the pandemic, it's rapidly increased in terms of the pace. And so really thinking about this shift into thinking about human rights for health in the digital context really adds a very strong layer of complexity, because even when we talk to some of our colleagues and we say, these are some of the things that we are looking at. There's so much we are having to think about. Right now at GNP Plus, we are implementing a community centered for people living with HIV, an app called Voice Plus, which is designed for networks of people living with HIV. And one of the things that they've appreciated, the networks, about that is the fact that it's considerably a safe platform based on their understanding of this is a tool that's just, you know, kept specifically for the networks. And it's a hectically, you know, heavily, maybe not hectically, but heavily co-creative process. But there's so much work around digital literacy and really informing people about how human rights monitoring works within the digital context, for example, some of the things that we've had to look at. And I think there's a lot of capacity building and strengthening work within the CSO space around what advocacy and resilience and resistance looks like within this particular context. And I think that's something that will really start to shape the process of decolonization, because from civil society and communities, we are talking to and referring to people who are often facing the problems and would therefore know what the solutions are. So first point would be inclusive, co-creative processes from a design perspective, programming perspective, Meg, but also really thinking about the fact that these are also institutions and initiatives and organizations and structures that are shifting, having to find themselves shift from a not so digital human rights advocacy space. And now they're having to figure out things like surveillance capitalism, which is probably terms that they've never heard before. But that's something that's crucial and important for us to know in order for us to be able to, you know, to fight and defend our rights in the online space. So again, I think there's so many layers, but really it's around the empowerment, the literacy, particularly from these you know, CSOs and community organization, and see that unravel then into participatory activism and really informed kinds of activism and decolonization.
Can I say something? So it seems to me that we are in a particular moment where in some ways, we can galvanize global alliances like we did with AIDS, because for the first time, so I've been doing this work for a while, and for the first time this year, I was able to tell people, you know, that contact tracing app that you have. So imagine AIDS in this form. And so I think that we are in this moment where we can galvanize those alliances around what is happening to this data. This is a global problem, and we need some collective solutions about what is happening. Because while I do agree that there is some resistance from below, I think that there is also some global alliances that we can make around data and extraction, and also about whether or not this is a desirable thing, that we want corporations to behave in this way. And I think that there are ways in which this crisis has maybe made us re-articulate some of those questions in different ways that I think that we could start to do differently, both now, but also in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I want to see if I see Daniel's ready to jump in. I just also wanted to look at one of the questions. So Daniel, maybe you could reflect on this in your answer also, is what the opportunities are to limit exploitation from private sectors, given the fact, and you raised this, the huge influence that they have in governments. Any thoughts on that as you think about the future?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I think that in this role, important role, the government is the stakeholder. We cannot start to think in the Wild West and take the justice in our own hands. We need to empower the governments. We need to be more involved. I think sometimes people is not my problem. It's the problem of the government. It's the problem of the, I don't know, the companies. But I think that this role of the civil society is very important, because when you demand for your rights and you start to talk with your neighbor, within your communities, in the work, in the university, you can start to build something to make some pressure for the civil demand. So I think that in this moving a little quick to my reflection there, I think that the academia, for example, it has an important role. I think it's my personal opinion. Sometimes the obsession in the academia is to generate papers for a journal, right? So I think that we need more knowledge, knowledge management, and produce new knowledge according to the context. But I don't know, make easier the digestion of this evidence, because when you start to talk with the political level, you cannot start to talk with them with a paper in your hand. You need to start with something easier that they understand, because we assume that all the politicians are high educated, and it's not necessary. So we need this kind of evidence more easy to digest, as I said, for the politician, for the population. In countries where we have a low rates of literacy, it's impossible that the population reads a journal, for example. So we need to start from the academia to generate different layers, as Nomika mentioned, for all the audiences. And in this scenario, I think that we need to understand also that the gaps, the education gaps, the health gaps, no matter if it's with or without technology, we have to solve this gap. The problem, I think, that is not the technology. The problem is the gaps that we have, the inequity that we have in our countries. We cannot solve the problem of the data without thinking in the problem of the social gaps. And finally, I think that it's important to understand that we are living in a different scenario. There are no boundaries at this moment. We can have a cyber crime using a server in China and a hacker in Russia, and the crime is committed in Guatemala. So you have this different scenario. So you need to promote a digital culture in all the sector of the population. Thank you.
Well, if I can add a few thoughts here, because I mean, as far as the Q&A question that was raised, but also I just wanted to respond to Sharifa's point, because I thought it was quite interesting that when we think about changing capitalism or ending capitalism, most of us feel powerless. I mean, I think Zizek said it's easier to imagine the end of God than the end of capitalism. But I think it's interesting that when we start to talk about colonialism, which is an older problem, right? Even predates capitalism. But I think many of us from the global South suddenly feel empowered because we feel, oh, I understand this dynamic. I think I can do something about it. So I think that's a very interesting point. As far as the question in the Q&A, I think the private sector can do a lot. It's amazing to me that right now, if a car maker wants to design a new car, they know they need to meet certain emission standards. But if a corporation is deploying a database, it's the Wild West. They can do whatever they want, and there are no limits to extracting data for a particular purpose. We can change that through regulation. We can make it possible not just react once algorithms have wreaked havoc, but we can be more proactive about it and make sure those tools during the design process are in place so that corporations know they cannot do certain kinds of things with our data, with the data of users. And just to end, I would like to go back to the point about colonialism. I think basically the greatest tool in the fight against colonialism has always been imagination. When colonialism we weren't able to resist it with our bodies, we could resist it with our minds. And so I think decolonizing data is essentially a cultural and creative movement that we can all participate in. It's not just about let's pay individuals for their data so that the extraction can continue. It's about reimagining how we use data in ways that empower and protect, especially the most vulnerable among us.
Thanks, Ulysses, and thank you to the other panelists. Daniel had to leave because he's busy with some other webinars that are happening at the same time. I think, Meg, do you want me to go ahead and do the closing? And then, or the other thing that I wanted before I have a few minutes of closing, for the other panelists, Nomtika, Ulysses, and Sharifa, is there anything that was not brought up in the last few minutes or the last half an hour we were talking that is your top of mind, something that's your, the thing that keeps you up at night when it comes to date? I know lots of things keep us up at night, but this in particular, so many things, but particularly around digital colonialism. So back to each of you. Nomtika, since you're up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on this, discussion around the private sector and the role of the private sector. And I see that there's someone who's also asked a question around data protection laws. And I just wanted to also just add that I think another thing that's important, if really these data protection laws and frameworks to an extent can work, because I'm in South Africa, where from a reproductive justice perspective, we have really pretty laws, but they're not being implemented that well. So I also know that, some of these papers and policies can just be there. And I think another example that we were looking at, because we actually had a moment of just reflecting on these frameworks, was things in places such as Ghana, for example, where they have an e-health strategy, but the implementation of that isn't necessarily to its best at the very least, or to just its basic capacity, because of just the general geographic stratification around digital access. And so in holding the private sector accountable, or in working with, because I don't even know how we want to frame involving the private sector and working with the private sector, I think it's important to look at these e-health strategies and cybersecurity laws, for example, in countries like Vietnam, data protection acts, and how they actually come together to form some form of a health governance framework that can actually be trackable and actually be beneficial to service users or people who actually give off their data. Because it's important to have these laws in place, but also sometimes if they're just there so we can say that they're there, it's important to strengthen them so that the private sector can be accountable, but also just to emphasize that maybe the role then of civil society to come in can then be to work with the states in establishing those laws and frameworks, but also ensuring that the implementation is done well at the very least.
Yeah, so maybe if I could add something. So Ulysses had a really good point about kind of using our imagination in different ways. And for me, one of the things that has struck me, so health is a super regulated field in every single country in the world. So nobody will allow you to kill a patient. But the ways in which we conceptualize harm in the digital space is very limited. It's kind of very limited because if we do not see harm in the next, if the patient doesn't die, then that is not harm. And I think that there are ways of conceptualizing harm in different ways. We do this in many fields. So we think about harm to children fundamentally differently than we did 10 years ago. And I think that we can really start to reimagine harm in different ways in order to make regulation just so much better to counter it. And I think that that is so important. I think the second thing is to really imagine health as a communal good. If this crisis has taught us anything, it's this idea that we are all impacted if one person's health is bad. And I think that digital health really gives us this moment to reimagine health differently. It really gives us those tools to use the rights to health in a fundamentally different way. And I think that is another thing. So if we can then imagine health differently, we can also imagine the goods that accrue from health in a different way. And so I think that this is a really good moment to do some of this like really important work, both conceptually, but also to kind of have experiments about the kinds of things that work. And so to me, it really strikes me that, yeah, we can use our imagination in different ways. And I'd like to continue these conversations outside this webinar.
I think this is an incredible discussion. I'm afraid we're just about out of time, so I'm going to pass the baton back to Mandy to share some wisdom and concluding thoughts as we wind up.
All I'm going to do is literally take the wisdom that I've heard. So, I mean, I've I've learned a lot. Thank you very much for my very selfish point of view. I think a few things that really struck me is that data, is borderless, and this is what Sharif was showing, and the actual regulations are usually constrained within a border. And then this whole thing about what Ulysses was saying, we need to reimagine how we see the space. And then again, what Sharifa said about, again, using your imagination, because that data is not harmless. And because in the health field, if it's not a physical harm to a person, and even mental well-being harm, we don't even define that well. So we don't see data as harmful, or the way we use it, because we don't see the actual physical, the person's not bleeding or dying. Hey, they weren't harmed, and we move along. So that was really, something that we need to really rethink. And then I think the thing that came across from most of the panelists was the unethical nature of how we actually get data from people. These are people desperate for services, and it's like, give us all your data points and we will give you service. And I mean, this is totally unethical, but this practice continues, and this is that whole wild west. And the whole thing about using the word colonialism then flips the switch and says we can, and I, as somebody, as I said, whose people have been colonized twice, I feel more empowered. This is something I know how to push back on and know how to do that. And then being able to work on this is something that, the whole thing about civil society and civil society's role, that it's one of the most powerful mechanisms that can flip the switch and allow these, the bodies that are doing the data extraction to then be held accountable. And I just want to talk a little bit, just 1 minute, about Transform Health. We are working on a health data governance principle, which will become a framework, which is one of the ways we're working with civil society, or civil society is driving this, to actually try and flip the switch so that we start controlling this wild west. So thank you so much. This was fantastic. I'm so sorry I spoke really fast because I was trying to get all the points across at super speed. I encourage everyone, I mean, you can see people's names and surnames and you can contact and reach out to us. I think that for me, Meg, I think what was interesting, I've never had like Sharifa and Ulysses, those kind of viewpoints come into the digital space. So it was very different, because when you bring people in, like the panelists we have with Nomtika and Daniel as well, it puts a whole different flavor on the space. So back to you, Meg. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Mandy, for a fabulous job of co-moderation. And I'm going to pass the ball over to my colleague, Elisa, to tell us about the next exciting event.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you all for joining us today. So the Global Health Center organizes a lot of discussion throughout the year, which you can find on our website, that you can also see here on the slide. Tomorrow, we are also hosting an online discussion to reflect on the outcomes of the WHA special session. And then next week, we are planning 2 other events, one on Tuesday, in which we will discuss the issue of WHO financing, and then another one next Thursday, in which we will present the new book from Professor Leonard Rubinstein, analyzing the issue of attacks on healthcare. So thank you again for joining, and we really hope to see you again at our next event. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody. Keep safe.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.